Hello viewers, welcome back to a considerably late race review video this week, but we're back. It's Hungarian GP edition. Got a little bit to talk about today. It was a fairly good race. I very much enjoyed it on Sunday, but yeah, we've got a little bit to talk about. We've got predictions to discuss. I've got questions from you wonderful people. So we're gonna get straight into the chat right now. Okay, so we're gonna get into it now. So I was kind of gonna do this in chronological order, but now that I think about it, I might not. But we're gonna start with the beginning of the race, lap one, because there's quite a lot to talk about. Now, obviously the strategy, having Leclerc on pole, Piastri, Norris, Russell, Alonso, there was the potential, for quite a bit of action, and we certainly got it. I honestly think, I believe Matt Gallagher said this, but one of the most important things was that Russell needed to split the McLarens because it meant that they couldn't work together, and Russell did do that, obviously sweeping around the outside of Norris on lap one, and at turn one, and that split the McLarens for the first 12 laps or so. Ended up, having Norris drop behind Alonso, so down to 5th place, which really hampered him at the beginning of the race. And I think that was, obviously, Norris went on to win, but I think that was one of the key factors which sort of prevented the McLarens from leading 1-2 earlier than what they ended up. Obviously, Leclerc was able to hold on to his lead until about lap 40 or so. That's when the Ferrari started going downhill, and might get into that a bit later. But I think that was a very crucial race start, and one of the most crucial ones we've had all season, 100%. Purely just because of the impacts it had. Obviously, Piastri had a fairly okay start. Leclerc had the jump on him down to turn one. It left Leclerc with an open turn in, nothing to worry about. On the way into the first corner, it essentially made Oscar have to think about Norris. Because you saw when they got off the grid, Piastri initially he tucks into Leclerc's slipstream, hoping to get a move done there, but then he looks in his mirrors and he notices Lando behind him, and then you can tell his focus immediately shifts from attacking Leclerc to defending against Lando into turn one. He switches lines like twice, so he goes to the left and then goes to the right. Lando follows him. And I think that was also Lando's mistake at the start, was following Oscar to the inside. Because by doing that, by following Oscar to the inside of the racetrack, it opened up a very nice spot for both George and Fernando to put their cars into. If you have a look at the race start, especially with Fernando's on board, you can see Norris go right with Oscar. So George goes left, and Fernando just follows George, and they both go around the outside of the McLaren. So I think that was Norris's big mistake. It wasn't a bad start by any means, but I think he got a little bit too target fixated on Oscar down into turn one, and that is sort of what cost him in the first sort of 10 laps or so, while he got back past Fernando and George. But it leads me on very nicely, sort of into the next session, or sorry, the next section of this video. I wanted to talk about the last 10 laps with the two McLarens and the whole strategy and everything going on there. And I do have a few questions to get into. So the first question comes in from Hubert, and he asks, who has the better momentum going into Zandvoort? Will Lando close the gap, or will Piastri extend it? Now, that is a very good question to ask, a very good topic to discuss. It's hard to tell. Obviously, Lando, he's won quite a few of the most recent races. Obviously, Hungary, Silverstone, Piastri did win in Spa. But it seems as though, on the surface level, that Lando has had the edge over Oscar in the last 5 to 6 races. But I think, as much as it does look like that, I do think Oscar has the momentum. And the reason for that is if you notice, right, Lando, he's won the last few races, but every time Lando has won, Oscar's been in second. And I think, like, you just can't see that as a negative if you're Oscar or if you're on Oscar's side of the garage. Like, it's just not a negative in my eyes. The fact that, yes, your teammate is winning, but every time he's won, it hasn't been by big margins. It's been by a second, 2 seconds, half a tenth, or sorry, 5/10 of a second, like we saw uh, this this week. So, like, every time Norris has won the race, Oscar's been right there, and has just fallen a little bit short. So I don't think Oscar can take that as a negative. And I think if he has the viewpoint of, I'm right there with Lando, even if he's winning, I'm always there. I don't think he'll let that momentum fall away from him. And he's a very resilient character. So I do think, the momentum, at least mentally, is with Oscar at the moment. He's resilient, he's smart, he knows what he's doing, and I think for those reasons, I do think the momentum is with Oscar at the moment. Okay, but then that is a fairly nice segue, I guess, into the most important part of the race, which is obviously the difference in strategy between Lando and Oscar, and in the last 10 laps, where Oscar had to chase down Lando for the race win, and the bits that came of that. So I've seen a lot of stuff going around online of, it's Lando favoritism, and it's this and it's that, and Lando had the better strategy, and Oscar got screwed over by McLaren again. What I have to say about that, now, I did think it was favoritism initially, because I'm an idiot. I did say that on a group chat I'm on, but looking at it now with a totally unbiased view, I can tell you what actually happened was definitely not favoritism. And I guess it's a good time to talk about sort of why that phrase gets thrown around so much. Obviously, if you've got two drivers in the fight for a world championship, you're always going to do different strategies, right? That's just it's just the way it unfolds. Max and Lewis in 21, they were always doing different things, trying to get overcuts, undercuts. Obviously, in 2021 in Abu Dhabi, in the final laps when we had the safety car, Max pits for softs, Hamilton stays out on hards. That's like a perfect example. And regardless if you're on the same team or not, you've got to try these alternate strategies. But that's just the fact of the matter is that Oscar and Lando are on the same team. And when you are on the same team in a championship fight, you tend to see, like, divisions between both sides of the garage, which then affect the big thing, which is strategy. Obviously, we've had big inter-team rivals in the past. We've had Hamilton and Alonso in 2007 at McLaren. We've had Prost and Senna at McLaren. We've had, countless others. So, obviously, Hamilton and Rosberg at Mercedes. So, this isn't something which is new to Formula One. It's happened plenty of times in the past. And when you have drivers fighting for the title within the same team, it essentially, the best way to look at it is it essentially splits into two teams within the same team. You have both sides of the garage, one side of the garage being for Lando, and one side being for Oscar. You have Oscar's mechanics, you have Lando's mechanics, you have Oscar's race engineer and strategist, and you have Lando's race engineer and strategist. And when you have this, it creates this big division, and the main place we see that is with strategy. It's not favoritism, it's just a difference in strategy, one side of the garage trying to get an upper hand over the other. And that's why it's not favoritism, but that's why it can look like favoritism. When one side of the garage hits the nail on the head, gets the strategy correct, obviously it's going to look like, Zach Brown favors Norris, obviously. That's not the case. It's just that side of the garage got the strategy correct that time. But it does just look like favoritism because they're part of the same team. But the way to look at it is they're kind of not part of the same team once they're in a title fight. So that's why we had the difference in strategy. That's why a lot of people were saying it was favoritism. It wasn't. But looking into the strategy, it was quite clear to see that the one stop did work. Obviously, Oscar was on the was on the safer strategy, you know, the two-stop. Basically, everyone on the grid did the two-stop apart from, I believe, Lando, and Fernando Alonso. Correct me on that, I might be wrong. But the reason Oscar went on to the two-stop were two reasons. One, he was in front of Lando at the time, so obviously he gets the preferential treatment within the team. Obviously, track position means you get to come in first. That's just like a rule of thumb in Formula One. That's just how we do it. And then the other reason is that due to him coming in first, they weren't really sure if the one-stop was possible, so they sort of had to do the norm, play it safe, and put him on a two-stop strategy, which in theory could have worked. And it did work. You know, we got to the end of the race, he was quick, he was right on the tail of Lando at the end, so in a way, that strategy did work. But because Lando was behind on track, and therefore had to come into the pit second, they were able to be braver with strategy, and they were like, we don't have much to lose. Obviously, you know, McLaren are just going to dominate this constructors, so they are able to fight each other. So they said they had nothing to lose. They went for the one stop, and it paid off. You know, Hungary is obviously it's not as hard to overtake as others, like we saw today. Obviously, you know, we had the you know, quite a lot of passing with the DRS and stuff like that. So it's not the most impossible place to overtake. But it is tricky enough, and that was one of the key reasons why the one-stop worked today, because it gave track position. Obviously, you know, when Oscar came out of the pits for his second stop, you know, he was 8.5 seconds behind Lando, but obviously he was able to make that up, but it's not easy to pass around Hungary, so that is why it ended up working. But it was a big effort from Oscar to actually catch up to Lando in the end. But that is what I had to say, sort of about the strategy. Obviously, it wasn't favoritism. Both drivers drove exceptionally well. You know, Lando did well to go so far on the hards, and Oscar did really well to extract all the pace he could out of that car. And they both drove superbly well. But that leads me on to another question. Okay, and this leads me on to another question from another viewer. This is a very interesting one, which I really wanted to discuss, because it's a very nice talking point. This question comes in from Mr. Jed Van Hermit, also known as Grilled Pixels, and he says, what if Piastri didn't lock up and instead hit Lando on lap 69? Now, I'm sure we all remember this move, a very key part in the battle, and oh my god, oh my god, Oscar came close to running into the back of Lando. And if that had happened, that would have just set off the fireworks at McLaren. I do genuinely believe that, because, like, when they got to turn one, like Oscar was 0.5 of a second back. That is a big lunge. If he was to pull that off, that is a big lunge from 0.5 of a second. Obviously didn't pull it up, locked up the brakes. Lando comes across to take the racing line, which he's completely allowed to do. There was nothing wrong with that before anybody says anything. But yeah, they came within like 5 centimeters of Oscar killing Lando. And if they had done that, I think the championship would have taken a very different turn. I think that would have soured things very, very quickly. I think, because obviously, if contact was made, obviously Oscar would have come off worse. Oscar would have been the one with the damage. If they had hit, obviously with the angle, it would have. What would have probably happened? It probably would have left Oscar without a front wing, and it would have left Lando facing the wrong way. That's what would have resulted from the immediate contact. But with that, you know, it probably would have dropped it would have dropped Oscar maybe out of the points, possibly, and it would have dropped Lando to about 8th if he could recover. Obviously, depends on what kind of diffuser and rear-wing damage he picks up from a contact of that nature. But if they had collided, I think it would have just nosedived into Senna Prost territory levels of hate towards one another. If they had collided, it would have been 100% on Oscar, because he was the one that made the move, he was the one that missed the move, and it would have been the one to initiate the collision. But yeah, I think if they had collided, it would have been like say goodbye to that friendship. That would have just been, I think, game over. And I think from here on in, if that had happened, the championship would have taken. I mean, I don't want to say a darker turn. That's not really the right word. It would have taken a much more aggressive turn if they had hit each other. Okay, so that is the sort of main part of this race out of the way. And we're going to move into a few more niche things, a few more things I want to talk about. I got a few more questions to discuss, so we're going to get into those right now. The first one, once again from Hubot, who asks, "What are your thoughts on Russell and Leclerc?" Now, obviously, this is in reference to the moving under braking scenario and Leclerc's erratic driving penalty. Obviously, you guys would know I'm a big Russell fan, but I'm going to go into this with an open mind. Obviously, there were two moments. So there was the first moment where George claimed Leclerc moved under brakes, and then there was the second moment of it, which Leclerc got the penalty for. Obviously, we know with George, he's a very, I guess you could say, flamboyant person over the radio. He's always complaining, which I don't like that much about him, but I still like my favourite driver. But he does complain a lot, and that is just a fact. He does complain a lot. So I guess we'll talk about the first one. Going down the straight, Russell behind, he pulls out. Leclerc has a tiny bit of movement. It's not much. And then George is immediately on the radio going, "Oh, he moved under brakes. That's unacceptable." That first one between the two, that's not moving under brakes. In all honesty, it's not moving under brakes. Like, you can see Leclerc does make a small movement, but it's not anything worthy. It's definitely not worthy of a penalty. And it's not really worthy of anything else, to be completely honest. He didn't move under brakes. He just sort of moved over on his line a bit. So it's not a penalty. It's not moving under braking. And George was just complaining because, it's heat of the moment. This is someone who gets very flustered. I wouldn't say flustered, but this is a driver who gets very sort of hyper on the radio. And this is not just in a whinging capacity. This is in every capacity. We saw it last year in Austria. Both Max and Lando collide, and Toto gets on the radio to George and he goes, "Oh, you can win this, George. You can win this." And then George is just like, "Just let me fucking drive, bro." So this is just what George is like. But yeah, it wasn't worthy of a penalty, and it wasn't worthy really of George's comments over the radio. But then moving into the second time, which was, I believe, a lap later, and that was definitely worthy, I think, of the penalty. It was George, he's already pulled out, and you can see Charles doesn't change his line. I'm gonna get my wheel to demonstrate, right? So this is Charles. He's got his wheel. He's held it straight. Russell has pulled out to go down the inside. And as George pulls out, you can see Leclerc's head to the right hand side to see George pull out. And right as he looks over Charles, right as he looks over, he jerks the wheel to the right to cut off George, and obviously the penalty ensues. So, what we call that in the racing community, that is what's called a reactionary defensive move, which is not on. So that is why it was a penalty. It was a late reactionary defensive move, which is frowned upon and is clearly stated you can't do it in the rule book. And that is why the penalty was awarded. So my honest opinion on that whole thing, the first one was not a penalty. The second one was a penalty. And that was a Leclerc we don't see very often. That was a Leclerc driving in a bit of anger. But yeah, so that is what I had to say about that. Okay, so there's one more bit I want to mention in this video. Well, sorry, there's another question I want to mention before we get into one more part I want to talk about later on. And that question, once again, is from Hubot. Very dedicated this week with his questions. And he comes up with an interesting one. He asks, Aston Martin's performance compared to Spa, where do they go from here? Obviously, Aston Martin, a very solid race. P5 and P7. P5 for Alonso, P7 for Lance Stroll, and obviously in qualifying, P5 and 6 on the grid for the two Astons. And it is a good point to discuss. You know, where do they go from here? Obviously, we don't know the specifics on why they're so quick all of a sudden. You know, we don't know if Adrian Newey has had any impact on this car. He might have, he might not have. We honestly don't know for sure. But what we do know is that they have gotten quicker. And where do they go from here? I mean, a lot of people would say up. I don't think Aston are prioritising this season too much in the grand scheme of things. So, in my opinion, I don't think they are actually going to go up from here. I reckon they might plateau out around where they are now in terms of performance. You know, they got a good upgrade in, might leave it there. If you look at Hungary alone, they're like the 5th fastest team, which is good, right? That's a good base to work from going into the new regulations. So I think they'll plateau out from here. You know, remain with the upgrade they have now. 5th or 6th fastest team, which in Fernando Alonso terms means 3rd fastest team. And I think they'll bag some good points come the end of the season. And I think that's sort of where they'll go. I don't think they'll get any slower, but I don't think they'll get any faster. So I think they're just going to plateau out about there. And then the final thing I want to talk about in this video is a certain Gabriel Bortoleto. Now, this man is having the most anonymously good rookie season, I think, out of anyone on the grid. I think if you had asked, you know, who's the best rookie so far this season, if you had asked that 3 races ago, I would have said Isaac Hadjar, personally. Isaac is having a very good season, you know, hasn't done too much wrong, and has done a lot of good. But in the last 3 races, you sort of realise what Bortoleto is doing in that Sauber. You know, he was P6 in Austria. He's, I believe it's 8-6 in the quali head-to-head against Hulkenberg. You know, obviously Hulkenberg has had his moments, you know, podium in Silverstone, had that epic P19 to P5 in Spain. But Bortoleto's a rookie. This is a driver who has won the F3 title in his rookie year, has won the F2 title in his rookie year, did that epic last to first drive in Monza last year in F2. So this is no slouch, and he is really proving that at the moment. And I think, you know, if he keeps this up, which I don't see this slowing down at all, if Bortoleto keeps this stuff up, he's very much going to be, you know, a world champion in the future. I do genuinely think that. Because he is having a phenomenal run of form at the moment. And I don't think it is getting talked about enough. I think, I think it needs to be recognised more. Because, you know, this is like, this is like a 21-year-old kid. Obviously just a little bit older than me. This is a 21-year-old kid who's putting Saubers consistently in Q3, consistently in the top 10 every weekend. Like, there's levels to that. And he's definitely the best rookie on the grid currently. A lot of people would ask, you know, how would you rank the rookies? I would say, personally, I'd say Bortoleto is number 1. I would say Hadjar is number 2. Number 3, I would say, is a tie between Kimi and Ollie Behrman. I think they've both had their good moments. And then number 5, I mean, do you go with Jack Doohan or do you go with, you know, Colin Pinto? I guess I go with Jack Doohan. I don't classify Lawson in that rookie debate because he's already done like 16 races, so I don't quite qualify Lawson in there as a rookie. But yeah, going back to my original point, you know, Bortoleto is doing a phenomenal job at the moment, and I think it needs to be discussed a little bit more. You know, Q3 in every race, top 10 in every race, you know, mixing it with the Russells, with the Alonsos, with the Hamiltons and the Verstappens. So yeah, really, really good so far. But that is going to be it. Well, there we have it, everybody. Hopefully you all enjoyed another race review video. Obviously, it was Hungarian Grand Prix this week. A very good race, a very enjoyable one. And hopefully I covered everything that you guys had any questions for. I wanted to say thank you to Jed and Hubot for sending in those questions. And I encourage you all to do it when we return from the summer break for the next race. But that is going to be it from me. Stay safe, have an awesome day, make good choices. And I'm going to see you all in the next video. So take care, everybody. Ciao.